Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, how a musical dies. Most Broadway musicals, in the writing process, die ugly and forsaken deaths. And this Human Meme podcast is about just that sort of common, awful, unnecessary tragedy of love and purpose, all over the want of money. The Reverend Al Carmines was the spiritual leader of the Judson Church in New York City's famous Greenwich Village in the 1960s. Al Carmines was also a poet and a musical composer, and an inspiration to many people. Al Carmines mainly wrote really interesting musicals. He won many awards. He was a mainstay of the village scene. Then, tragedy interrupted, and Al Carmines had a brain aneurysm, and he almost died. His friends were worried about his long-term survival. Al Carmines lived and recovered. But, in the aftermath of his aneurysm, he was asked to resign from the Judson Church, all in the name of the goodness of fellowship, and to avoid a power struggle upon his return. And Al Carmines resigned in good faith. Al Carmines then started his own smaller church, first in his apartment and later in a building in New York City. And Al slowly regained his stamina and strength and talent. And when I met him in 1989 or so, he was teaching the history of musical theater at Columbia University in the city of New York, in the School of the Arts, on the graduate level. Now, I was never a student of Al Carmines, although I was a grad student at the time at Columbia. However, I did ultimately become a musical collaborator with Al Carmines when he turned from project mentor for a musical I was writing called Maslova, based on the Leo Tolstoy novel Resurrection, and he became my co-lyricist and composer. Yes, Al Carmines decided he wanted to move from mentor to collaborator. And that meant removing the original composer from the project. And that composer was an old Nebraska friend of mine who was, at the time, attending Stanford University in California on a full ride for his undergraduate degree. And tossing over my friend and former collaborator was a terrible decision to make. But Al Carmines was certain he was the better choice for the show than my friend. And it was made clear to me, if I wanted the musical to move forward, I had one chance, and one chance only. And Al Carmines was to be my new collaborator. So I was writing the musical book myself and sharing the lyrics load with Al. And when it came time to put it all together in the summertime, Al wanted money. And Dr. Howard Stein at Columbia University in the city of New York, who put Al and me together, found a small stipend, a little grant, to fend us over for a few months of mass hysteria as we completed the Tolstoy musical for a staged reading in the fall at Columbia. Now, writing a musical from start to finish in 3 months, from page 1 to page end, is a massive task. But Al Carmines and I were up to it. It was nothing short of a miracle. The hand of Christ upon us. That we were able to finish an impossible but self-set task. One of my first memories of Al Carmines is sitting in his living room and Al telling me directly, Christ is strong in you. And I took that as a great compliment about my spirit of being. But my wife told me I could not do that. My wife, who was raised a rock-ribbed Christian, said I could not translate something so specific and so religiously meaningful and turn it into a convenient civil truism. My wife told me Al Carmines was talking about Christ in you, not some sort of agnosticated spirit. And I took her point. Al Carmines turned out to be a great and kind collaborator. He was always full of din and joy. But when it came to rehearsal, after everything was written, things became a little rocky and uncertain, and the director, Bob Seaver, a longtime teacher and mentor to Al Carmines when Al was a young man. Bob and Al met when Al was in seminary school at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And Bob Seaver had to ask Al Carmines to stop coming to rehearsals because Al was disturbing the process with too many changes and interruptions. Bob Seaver explained we had to lock things down, as imperfect as they were, if we hoped to make our fall performance schedule at Columbia. Al Carmines did not take kindly to being banned from rehearsal, but he did stay away. Things got better, technically, from a procedural point of view, when we started putting the show together. And the staged reading went really well. We were well on our way to success beyond Columbia and into the professional realm of New York City theater. In many ways, Al often told me, he felt this Maslova musical was his resurrection, his first new musical of note since his aneurysm a generation ago. And that also meant that Al felt that we were telling his story, and not always the story of a reformed prostitute who tragically fell in love with the prince, as Tolstoy wrote. Then it came time to start rewriting the musical. Musicals are rewritten more than they are really written. And few people know the average developmental age of a new musical is 7 years from idea to Broadway debut. And that timeline includes using Broadway professionals who've won awards before. And 7 years is a long time to work on an idea with little to no pay. And that's why you so often see only the previously rich and successful writing new Broadway shows. The rest of us cannot afford the 7 years of starvation and inattention. Yes, and 7 years is also a curse, in that most successful Broadway authors can probably only create and get staged on Broadway maybe 3 shows in one lifetime, if they are super lucky and incredibly fortunate. And I'm just talking about getting a show to Broadway. I'm not talking about a hit show on Broadway. Some shows close after opening night. 7 years of work. Then dead, then gone, after 1 2-hour performance. And you are pretty much considered a success, a major hit on Broadway, if you can last 1 year. And that 1 year is tough because springtime on Broadway is always hard and dead. The Tony Awards helped spark some interest, but the weather is always bad in New York City, and the tourist season doesn't really begin for another 3 months. Getting to Broadway is a long, tough, lonesome haul, and pretty much closed to unproven first-timers. And the old saying, you either make a killing or you die trying in show business, is most true under the bright lights of the Broadway musical stage. So, Al Carmines wanted more money to continue revising Maslova after our fall debut at Columbia. Now, Al had a little bit of income from his church, but he was also living in Manhattan Plaza. And Manhattan Plaza is a subsidized apartment complex in New York City for artists, where you only pay a percentage of your rent in relation to the money you actually take home. So making rent for those who live in Manhattan Plaza is never an issue, because your ability to pay is tied to your ability to make no money. And if you make no money, you pretty much pay no rent. So when Al told me he would not continue to work on Maslova without more money, I was devastated, because I knew there was no more money anywhere at Columbia. Plus, there was already a big hoo-ha in the School of the Arts on the faculty side, because they felt that paying me, a student, to write a musical was uncouth. But I survived that revolt merely by writing an excellent musical. But for Al Carmines to now try to go back to a dry trough and demand the department cough up more money for him was never going to happen. And I told him so. There was no parlay to play. Al Carmines was unmoved. The Reverend Al Carmines wanted more money. I urgently told him if he took that hard line about demanding more money from Howard Stein at Columbia, he would not get a dime more for Maslova, and he would risk not being hired back to teach at Columbia, because the rest of the Columbia faculty were faced against us. Al Carmines was unmoved. The Reverend Al Carmines wanted more money. Al Carmines told Howard Stein at Columbia he wanted more money. And I told Al Carmines to contact me when he was ready to continue working on the Maslova musical. I never heard from Al Carmines again. Al Carmines never taught at Columbia again. There was no more money. Then, in 2005, Al Carmines died, dead at 69. I later came to learn through the musical grapevine, gossip vine, that is New York City musical theater, that shortly after Al's beloved mother died, half of Al died with her. Al spoke to his mother daily on the telephone. He loved her more than he loved himself. And because of that deep loss of his mother, Al Carmines became a bit of a recluse, even more than he already was. Al Carmines never really liked to leave his apartment unless he had to. And if you wanted to meet with Al, you always had to go to Al. He never came to you. And I was also told that after Al lost his mother, he became frightened of loss, and of his talent, and of an uncertain future without his mother alive in his life. And Al Carmines grew a giant, bushy, uncharacteristic beard that was more unruly than his talent. And I came to understand that Al Carmines had become a shell of himself, and no one was able to pull him back out of that spiraling, deepening hole of grieving and despair. And nobody wishes that sort of end for anyone. And that, my friend, was the official end of Maslova, the new Tolstoy musical. It was born in hope and died in the grave. And in that ugly, unnecessary, and grievous end, what was gained? A halfway, sparkling musical that was a miracle of being in itself, for being written and composed in 3 months. And all of that sweat and effort and human equity was for what? I understand Al Carmines valued his musical talent, and he wanted to be paid for it. But Columbia University is not a bank. And Al Carmines and I were given a one-time grant, one single shot to hit the bullseye and to beat the odds. And we almost made it. Until we didn't. And that was it. No matter who we are, a reverend, an agnostic, a child of God, a Christ receptacle, we must never let the love of money rule us, or even rent us, because the end is always terrible and predictable. The poundage becomes more valued than the originating effort. We should be happy with what we have, and be overjoyed by what we have earned, and we should always want to create something more to make things better. And so, in the din of the reverberating genius death of a giant talent, the rest of us are left to wonder. Not about what might have been written, but rather what should have been known. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.